The Imperial Palace absorbed sunlight from 3 stars and reflected none of it back. Kieran Ashford had been told this was intentional, something about symbolic architecture and the Empire's ability to consume all threats, but mostly it just made the building look like someone had carved a government headquarters out of concentrated midnight. He limped through the Hall of Victories, trying not to leave a trail of dried hive ichor on the pristine marble floors. Nobody had offered him time to clean up or change before the royal summons, which suggested either tremendous urgency or tremendous disrespect. Given that he'd technically saved the capital fleet 3 days ago, he was leaning toward urgency. The Valtheran guards flanking him moved with the eerie synchronization of people who'd trained together for decades. Their ceremonial armor was anything but ceremonial. Kieran had seen the weapon systems integrated into those ornate plates, had watched similar guards tear through hive warriors like they were made of tissue paper. "Captain Ashford," the guard on his left said, her voice modulated through her helmet. "You will address her Eternal Majesty as your Radiance on first greeting, then Majesty thereafter. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not approach the throne closer than 10 meters. You will. Will I need to bow, or is kneeling more traditional?" Kieran interrupted, earning a sharp look from both guards. "Whichever you prefer, provided it shows appropriate deference." "Got it, deference. I can do deference." He paused. "Does limping count as deference? Because I'm really good at limping right now." The guard on his right made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. They reached the throne room doors, which were 30 meters tall because apparently reasonable door sizes were for civilizations that lacked ambition. The doors split down the middle and swung inward without anyone touching them, revealing a chamber that could have housed a small city. The throne of eternal light sat at the far end, elevated on a dais that required climbing 47 steps to reach it. Kieran knew this because he counted them while trying not to pass out from exhaustion. The throne itself appeared to be carved from a single piece of crystallized starlight, which was probably impossible, but so was most of what he'd seen in the past 3 days. The court filled the chamber, hundreds of Valtheran nobles in formal attire, their elongated ears adorned with jewels that denoted rank and house affiliation. They watched his approach with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed contempt. Kieran was acutely aware that he was still wearing his combat fatigues, that he smelled like 3 days of fighting without sleep, and that his left arm was wrapped in emergency medical gel that had hardened into something resembling amber. And then there was the Queen. Queen Seraphine Valkyra sat perfectly still, which somehow made her more commanding than if she'd been gesturing or speaking. Her ears swept back from her face in an elegant curve, pierced with silver that caught the light from the crystalline chandeliers overhead. Her eyes were violet, not metaphorically, not enhanced, but genuinely violet, like someone had stolen the color from a nebula and given her irises. She wore robes that shifted between deep blue and black depending on the angle, and a crown so delicate it looked like frozen lightning. She was, objectively, the most beautiful person Kieran had ever seen. She was also, according to the briefing materials he'd been given when Earth first established diplomatic contact, 347 years old, and had personally overseen the conquest of 17 star systems. Her expression suggested she'd never been impressed by anything in those 3 centuries and wasn't about to start now. Kieran climbed the steps, his injured leg protesting with every movement. When he reached the 10th step, a respectful distance, he hoped, he attempted something between a bow and controlled collapse. His knee buckled halfway through. He caught himself on the railing and decided to call it a kneel. Close enough. "Captain Kieran Ashford of the Terran Diplomatic Corps," announced the Lord Chancellor, a severe-looking Valtheran whose ear jewelry suggested he was approximately the 3rd most important person in the Empire. Attached to the Imperial fleet as military liaison, credited with the destruction of the Hive Command Nexus during the Battle of the Crimson Nebula. sole survivor of the flanking maneuver that broke the Hive's siege of the capital fleet. The Chancellor made it sound impressive. He left out the part where Kieran's entire unit had been vaporized, where he'd spent 6 hours drifting in a damaged escape pod watching Hive ships tear through the outer defenses, where he jury-rigged a boarding torpedo out of spare parts in desperation. "Captain Ashford," the Queen said, and her voice was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd ruled for 3 centuries. Absolutely certain, completely controlled, devoid of doubt. "You have rendered service to the Valtheran Empire at great personal cost. Tradition demands that we offer you a single wish in recognition of your sacrifice. You may ask for land, title, wealth, or any resource within our considerable power to grant." The court leaned forward, probably expecting him to ask for a governorship or a mining operation, or whatever humans were supposed to want. Kieran looked up at the Queen, really looked at her, and saw something that made his chest hurt. She sat alone on that massive throne, surrounded by hundreds of courtiers and advisors, and she was completely isolated. He'd seen that expression before, during the battle, when she'd stood on the command deck making decisions that would save millions while condemning thousands. He'd watched her order entire squadrons into suicide runs without her voice wavering, had seen her calculate acceptable losses with mathematics that would haunt her forever. Nobody should have to carry that alone. "Your Radiance," he said, remembering the protocol at the last second. "I need a minute to think." A ripple of shocked whispers ran through the court. Apparently, making the Queen wait wasn't traditional. Seraphine's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those violet eyes. "You may have your minute, Captain." Kieran used the time to ask himself if he was about to do something incredibly stupid or incredibly brave. The answer came back, definitely stupid, possibly brave, absolutely necessary. He took a breath, met the Queen's gaze, and made his choice. "I don't want land or titles or wealth," he said. "I want something else entirely." "Name it." Her voice remained steady, but he saw her fingers tighten slightly on the armrest. "I choose you." The throne room fell into the kind of silence that happens when everyone stops breathing at the same time. The Lord Chancellor's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Several courtiers looked around as if checking whether they'd heard correctly. Queen Seraphine Valkora, ruler of 300 star systems, commander of fleets that could crack planets, a woman who'd stared down galactic warlords without flinching, sat frozen on her throne. For the first time in 347 years, she had absolutely no idea what to say. The silence stretched long enough that Kieran started to wonder if he'd accidentally committed some kind of treason that resulted in immediate execution. Nobody moved. The guards flanking the throne had their hands on their weapons but seemed uncertain whether to actually draw them. The Lord Chancellor had progressed from speechless to actively gesturing at other advisors in a silent pantomime of, "What do we do?" Seraphine's violet eyes remained locked on Kieran's face, searching for something. He wasn't sure what she was looking for, but he kept his expression as honest as he could manage while exhausted and in pain. Finally, she moved. Not dramatically, Seraphine didn't do dramatic. She simply stood, and the entire court seemed to exhale in relief that their queen was still capable of motion. "Lord Chancellor," she said, her voice carrying across the vast chamber. "Clear the room. Your Radiance, I must protest." Now, the single word carried 3 centuries of absolute authority. The Lord Chancellor bowed deeply and began shepherding courtiers toward the exits. There was grumbling, whispered conversations, more than a few backward glances at the human who'd apparently lost his mind. It took 7 minutes to empty the throne room. Kieran spent them kneeling on the 10th step, trying not to sway from fatigue. When the last courtier finally left and the massive doors boomed shut, the silence was different, less shocked, more expectant. Seraphine descended from the throne with movements that suggested she'd spent centuries perfecting the art of controlled grace. Each step was precise, measured, completely at odds with what Kieran suspected was happening inside her head. She stopped 3 steps above him, close enough that he could see the faint constellation of silver markings along her temples, either tattoos or natural pigmentation. He couldn't tell. Close enough that he could see her hands were trembling ever so slightly. "Explain yourself," she said quietly. Not angry, confused maybe, possibly frightened, though he suspected queens weren't supposed to admit fear. Kieran shifted his weight off his injured leg. "I watched you during the battle, on the command deck. I was commanding the fleet. That's generally where one finds military commanders during battles. You were standing alone." He met her eyes. Everyone else was running analysis, coordinating squadrons, managing logistics. You were alone, making the decisions nobody else wanted to make. I saw you order the 7th Fleet into a holding action that you knew would destroy them. I saw your face when you did it. Something flickered across her expression, pain quickly suppressed. That was strategic necessity, acceptable losses to achieve. I know what it was. Kieran's voice was soft. I also know what it cost you to make that call. I saw it in your eyes. Seraphine's hands clenched into fists. You presume too much, Captain. I am a queen. I have made such decisions for 3 centuries. They do not. They haunt you, Kieran interrupted, and immediately regretted it when her eyes flashed with anger. But he'd started, so he might as well finish. Every single one haunts you. You remember their names, don't you? All the squadrons, all the units you've sent into battles they wouldn't survive. You carry them. She was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. How dare you? I dare because someone should. He pulled himself upright, wincing at the protest from his leg. Your Radiance, I've been here for 6 months. I've watched how your court treats you, like a monument, like a weapon, like a mathematical equation that solves problems. Nobody treats you like a person. I am a queen. You're also a person who's been alone for 300 years. Seraphine took a step back, and Kieran realized he'd hit something true. Her carefully controlled expression was cracking at the edges. You don't know anything about me, she said, but there was less conviction in it now. I know that when you granted me a wish, I could have asked for anything. Land, titles, a ship, a planet, but all those things. He gestured vaguely at the throne room. They're just more isolation, more distance. I didn't save your empire because I wanted compensation. I saved it because it needed saving, and I was in a position to help. Then why ask for anything? Because you needed to grant me something. Tradition demands it, and you're too honorable to break tradition even when it's inconvenient. He took a careful step upward, closing some of the distance between them. So I asked for the only thing I actually want. You. That's insane. But she didn't move away. Probably. I've been told I have terrible survival instincts. But choosing me isn't choosing a person, Captain. It's choosing 3 centuries of mistakes, of decisions that require calculation rather than mercy, of watching everyone I've ever cared about age and die while I continue. It's choosing someone who's forgotten how to be anything except duty. I watched you send 7,000 soldiers to their deaths, and then go immediately to the memorial wall to add their names yourself. Kieran's voice was steady. You didn't delegate it. You didn't let some aide handle it. You carved their names into stone with your own hands because you believed they deserved that much from the person who gave the order. That's not someone who's forgotten how to be human. I'm not human. Neither is compassion. Seraphine stared at him, her violet eyes searching his face for deception, for political maneuvering, for any of the 1,000 hidden agendas she'd navigated for centuries. Kieran kept his expression open, honest, tired. You're serious, she said finally, and it wasn't quite a question. Completely. You're asking me to what exactly? To accept you as a consort, a companion. To integrate you into my life, as if 3 centuries of solitude can be undone by one foolish human with a death wish. I'm asking you to let someone choose you for you. Not for your crown, not for your empire, not for political advantage. Just you, the person behind all that duty. Her hands were shaking again, more noticeably now. "That's not how this works. Queens don't, I can't just—" She stopped, seemingly unable to finish the thought. Kieran waited. He'd said his piece. The next move was hers. "I need time," Seraphine said finally, "to think, to consider the implications." "Take all the time you need. You're being remarkably patient for someone who just made an impossible demand." "It's not a demand, it's an offer. You can refuse, I'll survive." Something in her expression softened slightly. "Will you?" "Eventually." He managed a tired smile. "I'm pretty resilient. Comes with being human, we're stubborn about staying alive even when we shouldn't." She almost smiled, almost. "Lord Chancellor will arrange quarters for you, guest wing. I'll summon you when I've made my decision." "Thank you, Your Radiance." Seraphine turned to leave, then paused halfway back to her throne. "Captain Ashford." "Yes. Why did you really choose me?" Kieran considered the question. "Because everyone in this galaxy wants something from you. Your power, your protection, your resources. But I've never heard anyone say they just want you. And I thought," he paused, "I thought maybe you deserved to hear that, once." When she finally looked back at him, her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears if queens were allowed to cry. She didn't say anything else. She simply walked back to her throne, summoned the guards with a gesture, and ordered them to escort Captain Ashford to the most comfortable quarters in the guest wing. As Kieran limped out of the throne room, he caught one last glimpse of the queen sitting alone on her massive throne, one hand pressed to her face, looking more vulnerable than anyone who'd ruled for 3 centuries should ever look. He hoped he hadn't just broken her, but maybe, just maybe, he'd given her permission to be human, even if she wasn't. The guest quarters were absurdly luxurious. Kieran had a sitting room, a bedroom with a bed designed to accommodate Valtheran physiology, which meant it was too large and too firm, but still better than sleeping in an escape pod, and a bathroom with water fixtures that apparently adjusted to the molecular composition of whatever species was using them. He showered for 45 minutes, watching 3 days of dried blood and hive ichor swirl down the drain, and tried not to think about what he'd just done. He failed spectacularly. By the time he collapsed into bed, he'd convinced himself that he'd committed either the bravest or stupidest act of his life, and he wouldn't know which until the Queen made her decision, if she decided at all. For all he knew, she'd simply ignore him until Earth recalled him, and he became a footnote in some diplomatic incident report. Human liaison temporarily lost his mind following combat trauma. Situation resolved through benign neglect. He slept for 16 hours straight and woke up to find someone had left a tray of food outside his door, and a set of clean clothes that were clearly Valtheran, but had been adjusted for human proportions. The palace staff, at least, seemed willing to pretend he wasn't completely insane. Over the next 3 days, Kieran existed in a strange state of limbo. No one summoned him. No one told him to leave. He was simply there. A human-shaped problem the Empire was politely ignoring while trying to figure out what to do with him. He spent the time exploring. The palace was massive enough that he could walk for hours without retracing his steps, and nobody stopped him. Guards nodded as he passed. Staff members bowed slightly, which made him uncomfortable until he realized they were just being polite. He found the memorial gardens on the second day, a vast courtyard filled with crystalline pillars, each one inscribed with names. Thousands of names. Hundreds of thousands. The casualties of the Empire's 3-century expansion, rendered permanent in stone and light. That's where he met the children. There were 6 of them, all between 5 and 10 years old by human standards, sitting in a cluster near one of the newer pillars. War orphans, Kieran realized. Their parents' names were still being carved into the fresh crystal. One of them, a little girl with silver markings on her temples, looked up as he approached. "Are you the human?" "I'm a human," Kieran said carefully. "Captain Kieran Ashford." "You're the one who made the Queen break," said an older boy with green-tinted eyes. "I didn't," Kieran paused. "What do you mean, break?" "Everyone's talking about it," the girl said. You said something to her, and she made everyone leave the throne room. Nobody ever makes the queen alone." "She's always alone," Kieran said quietly, then realized he was talking to children and probably shouldn't be discussing politics. "What are you doing out here?" "Looking at our parents' names," the boy said matter-of-factly. "Teacher says it's important to remember them." Kieran sat down on the grass near them, his legs still protesting but manageable. "Your teacher is right. Do you want to tell me about them?" They did. For the next 2 hours, 6 war orphans told a human stranger about their parents, about mothers who flew fighter craft and fathers who managed logistics, about family dinners and bedtime stories and ordinary moments that had ended 3 days ago when the hive arrived. Kieran listened to all of it. When the little girl started crying, he let her lean against his shoulder. When the boy asked if the hive would come back, Kieran told him the truth. He didn't know, but a lot of people were working very hard to make sure they didn't. "Are you going to stay?" the girl asked. "On Valthera Prime?" "I don't know," Kieran admitted. "That depends on the queen." "I hope you stay," she said. "You're nice. The queen needs nice people." From somewhere above, watching from a balcony, she told herself, she was just passing by for the 3rd time that day. Queen Seraphine Valkyra pressed a hand against the stone railing and tried to remember the last time someone had made war orphans smile. She couldn't. That evening, she summoned Lady Muravel to her private chambers, actual private chambers, not the state rooms where she conducted official business. Muravel had been her advisor for 60 years and was one of the few people who could speak candidly without fear of execution. "You're avoiding him," Muravel said without preamble. "I'm considering the political ramifications of his request." "You're terrified." Seraphine shot her a look that would have made most courtiers flee. Muravel just raised an eyebrow. "Your radiance, in the 60 years I've served you, I've watched you negotiate with warlords, survive assassination attempts, and make decisions that would break lesser rulers. I've never seen you afraid of anything." She paused. "Until now." "He asked me to choose him." "He asked you to let yourself be chosen. There's a difference." Seraphine moved to the window, looking out over the palace gardens. She could just barely see the memorial courtyard from this angle, though the human and the children had long since left. "I don't know how to do that, Myra. I've spent 3 centuries building walls so high that nothing could reach me, and this human just walked around them. By being honest, by being impossibly naive. Perhaps, or perhaps he understands something we've forgotten, that power and isolation aren't the same thing, even though we've treated them that way for generations." Seraphine turned from the window. "If I accept his wish, it changes everything. The court will be in chaos. Rival houses will see it as weakness. Our enemies will. Our enemies will see that the eternal queen is capable of something they thought impossible: vulnerability." Muravel's voice was gentle. "Your radiance, strength isn't the absence of weakness. It's having the courage to be weak when it matters. He could hurt me. Yes. He'll age and die while I continue. Yes. This is a terrible idea." "Probably," Muravel smiled. "But when has that ever stopped you from doing what's right?" Seraphine closed her eyes, and for a moment, she wasn't a queen. She was just someone who'd been alone for so long that she'd forgotten what connection felt like, and a human with terrible timing had reminded her. "Summon him," she said quietly. "Tomorrow evening. Here, not the throne room, private audience." "As you wish, your radiance." Muravel paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I think he's good for you. You smiled when you watched him with the children." "I did not smile." "Your radiance, I've known you for 60 years. You smiled." After Muravel left, Seraphine returned to the window and allowed herself a moment of honesty. She had smiled. And that terrified her more than any battle ever had, because battles had rules, strategy, acceptable losses, and calculated risks. But this was chaos. This was opening herself to something with no guaranteed outcome, no strategic advantage, no logical reason to proceed. This was choosing to be human in all the worst, most wonderful ways. And tomorrow evening, She would have to decide whether 3 centuries of isolation was worth maintaining, or whether one honest human had given her permission to try something different. The thought kept her awake until dawn. The summons arrived via a guard who looked deeply uncomfortable delivering it. Kieran accepted the formal invitation, handwritten on actual paper, which seemed excessive, and tried to calm the sudden acceleration of his heartbeat. Private chambers, not the throne room, either very good or very bad. He spent too long deciding what to wear, settling finally on the Valtheran-style clothing the palace staff had provided. It was surprisingly comfortable, though he felt vaguely like he was playing dress-up in someone else's culture. The walk to the Queen's private chambers took him through parts of the palace he hadn't seen before. Narrower corridors, fewer guards, more personal. The walls here weren't decorated with conquest murals and empire maps. Instead, they held simpler artwork, landscapes from different worlds, abstract pieces, even a few that looked like they'd been made by children. Lady Murivel met him outside an unmarked door. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if he'd passed some invisible test. "Captain Ashford, her radiance is expecting you." She paused, her expression softening slightly. "Be gentle, she's more fragile than she appears." "I'll try. And Captain, thank you, for reminding her she's allowed to be more than duty." Before Kieran could respond, Murivel opened the door and gestured him inside. The Queen's private chambers were nothing like he'd expected. No throne, no formal furniture, no displays of wealth and power. Instead, there was a sitting area with comfortable chairs, bookshelves filled with actual physical books, windows overlooking the gardens, and a sense of lived-in warmth that contradicted everything he'd heard about the Eternal Queen. Seraphine stood by the window wearing simpler robes than her formal court attire, her crown absent. Without it, she looked younger, more vulnerable, more real. "Your radiance," Kieran said, bowing slightly. "We're alone, Captain. You can dispense with the titles." She turned from the window. "Sit, please." He sat. She remained standing, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I've spent 3 days trying to understand why you asked for what you asked for," Seraphine said finally. "I've analyzed it from every political angle, examined your service record for signs of instability, consulted with advisors about human psychology and cultural norms. Do you know what I concluded? That I'm insane. That you were sincere." She moved to the chair opposite him, sitting with the kind of controlled grace that suggested centuries of practice. "And that terrifies me more than anything else." "Why?" "Because I know how to handle political maneuvering. I know how to navigate court intrigue and diplomatic deception. I've spent 300 years becoming an expert at detecting lies and hidden agendas." Her violet eyes met his. "I don't know what to do with honest want." Kieran leaned forward slightly. "What do you want to do with it?" "I don't know, that's the problem." She looked down at her hands. "You asked me why I'm always alone. The truth is, I chose it. After the 1st century, after watching everyone I cared about age and die while I remained unchanged, I decided isolation was safer. Duty was clearer. If I didn't allow myself to care about individuals, I could make the necessary calculations without emotion compromising judgment." "How's that working out?" "Terribly." The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. "I remember every name, Kieran. Every soldier I've sent into battles they didn't survive, every civilian I couldn't save, every choice that required sacrificing some to save others. I thought if I didn't let myself care, it would hurt less. But it doesn't. It just means I carry it alone." "You don't have to." "Don't I?" She stood, pacing to the window again. "You're asking me to open myself to connection, to allow someone close enough to matter. And you'll age, Kieran. In 50 years, you'll be an old man. In 60, you'll be gone. And I'll still be here, unchanged, carrying the memory of another person I let myself care about who left me behind." "That's true," Kieran said quietly. "I can't change that. Humans don't live as long as Valtherans. If you choose to let me in, you're choosing eventual loss." "Then why would I agree?" because the alternative is 3 more centuries of this. He gestured at the room, at the isolation she'd built around herself. You're not living, you're Seraphine, you're existing. There's a difference. She turned to face him and he saw tears in her eyes, the first time he'd seen her cry. I'm afraid. I know. I don't know how to be anything except what I've been. I don't know how to let someone close without seeing them as a weakness to be exploited or a variable to be calculated. You don't have to know. Kieran stood, crossing the room slowly, giving her time to tell him to stop. She didn't. You just have to try, that's all I'm asking. Not perfection, not certainty, just a chance. A chance at what? At being seen. At being chosen for yourself, not for what you can provide or command. At having someone who cares about you, not because of your crown or your empire, but because of who you are underneath all of that. Seraphine's hands were shaking. I don't even know who that is anymore. Then let's find out together. The words hung between them, and Kieran watched her process them. Watched 3 centuries of careful control war with the desperate loneliness she'd been carrying for longer than most civilizations existed. I've made terrible choices, she whispered. I've ordered executions. I've authorized actions that still haunt me. I've burned worlds to save systems, sacrificed millions to preserve billions. How can you look at me and see someone worth choosing? Because you remember them. Kieran took another step closer. You carry every decision, every name, every consequence. You don't hide from what you've done. You face it alone every single day. That takes more courage than any battle I've ever fought. That's not courage, that's just what has to be done. It's both. He was close enough now that he could see the constellation patterns in her temple markings, the way her ears trembled slightly with suppressed emotion. Seraphine, I'm not asking you to stop being a queen. I'm not asking you to change how you rule or compromise your duty. I'm just asking you to let someone stand beside you while you carry it. A tear slipped down her cheek, crystalline and perfect. What if I hurt you? What if I can't give you what you need? What if you can? He offered his hand, palm up, an invitation without demand. What if we try and it's messy and imperfect and sometimes difficult, but it's better than being alone? She stared at his hand like it was a weapon. Then, slowly, trembling, she reached out and took it. The moment her fingers touched his, something in her broke. Not violently, but like ice melting, like walls crumbling, like 3 centuries of carefully maintained distance dissolving in the face of one simple, honest touch. She made a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and Kieran pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her while she shook with the weight of finally allowing herself to be vulnerable. I don't know how to do this, she whispered against his shoulder. Neither do I. We'll figure it out. The court will be in chaos. Probably, rival houses will see it as weakness. Let them. This is a terrible strategic decision. The worst, he agreed, and felt her laugh against him. A real laugh, surprised and genuine. They stood like that for a long time, the eternal queen and the human captain, while outside the window 3 suns set over Valthera Prime, and the Empire continued its complicated existence without noticing that something fundamental had shifted in the palace. When Seraphine finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clear. I accept your wish, Captain Ashford, not as a transaction or a political arrangement, but as, she paused, searching for words, as a leap of faith. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You have no idea what you've signed up for. Enlighten me. I'm demanding. I work 16 hours a day. I have nightmares about battles from 2 centuries ago. I can't cook. I've literally never learned. I sometimes go 3 days without sleeping because there's too much to manage. I'm terrible at showing affection because I've forgotten how. Kieran kissed her. It was brief, gentle, and completely derailed her list of warnings. When he pulled back, she was staring at him with wide eyes. What was that? She asked. A reminder that you're allowed to stop talking and just exist for a minute. I don't know how. Then we'll learn together. That's kind of the whole point. Something in her expression softened completely. You're either very brave or very stupid. Definitely both. This time she smiled, a real smile, unguarded and genuine, and Kieran thought it might be the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. The next morning, the court assembled for routine business, and received the shock of their collective lives when Queen Seraphine Valcora entered the throne room with Captain Kieran Ashford walking beside her. Not behind. Not at a respectful distance. Beside her. The Lord Chancellor's expression suggested he was having a medical emergency. Seraphine ascended to her throne with Kieran standing to the right, a position traditionally reserved for consorts or designated heirs. The murmuring in the court grew louder. "Members of the court," Seraphine said, her voice carrying absolute authority even as her hand found Kieran's and held it where everyone could see. "Captain Ashford requested a wish, as is traditional for those who render extraordinary service to the Empire. I have granted that wish. He will remain at the palace as my chosen companion, a title that carries no political authority but all personal significance." The court erupted. Questions flew from every direction, most of them variations on "what does this mean?" and "is this legal?" Seraphine silenced them with a look. "Captain Ashford chose me. Not my crown, not my empire, not the advantages my position could provide. He chose me. And She paused, and Kieran saw the vulnerability flash across her face before she conquered it with the strength that had sustained her for 3 centuries. "I chose to accept that gift. Questions regarding precedent and protocol can be directed to the Lord Chancellor. This audience is concluded." She stood, still holding Kieran's hand, and walked out of the throne room while the court descended into chaos behind them. In the corridor, away from eyes and expectations, she leaned against the wall and let out a shaky breath. "That was terrifying," she said. "You were perfect. I have no idea what happens next." "Neither do I." He squeezed her hand gently, "but we'll figure it out together." She looked at him,